In the annals of music history, few stories are as dramatically compelling as that of Elvis Aaron Presley, a man who revolutionized popular culture, lost his way in the glittering maze of fame, and then clawed his way back to reclaim his throne. From the electrifying nights at Sun Records to the bloated Vegas years, from cultural obscurity to the triumphant '68 comeback special, Elvis's journey mirrors the very soul of America itself. Ambitious, excessive, fallen, and ultimately redeemed. This is not just the story of a singer, but of a king who abdicated his throne only to fight his way back to glory. Elvis Presley didn't just enter the music scene in 1954, he detonated it. When the 19-year-old truck driver walked into Sun Records that July afternoon, he carried with him the cultural DNA of the American South, the pain of gospel, the rebellion of country, and the raw sexuality of rhythm and blues. What emerged from that studio session wasn't just a new sound. It was a seismic shift that would crack open the conservative facade of 1950s America. The fusion was explosive and unprecedented. Elvis took the sacred and the profane, the white and the black, the rural and the urban, and melded them into something entirely new. His voice carried the spiritual fervor of the Pentecostal churches he'd grown up in, while his body moved with a sensuality that scandalized parents and electrified teenagers. When he gyrated his hips on the Ed Sullivan Show, he wasn't just performing, was unleashing a sexual revolution that would define the next decade. Sam Phillips had famously said he could make $1 billion if he could find a white man with a Negro sound and feel. In Elvis, he found something even more powerful, a cultural alchemist who could transmute the deep traditions of American music into pure gold. The boy from Tupelo possessed an intuitive understanding of rhythm and melody that couldn't be taught in any conservatory. He absorbed influences like a sponge from Dean Martin's crooning to Big Boy Crudup's blues, from the Blackwood Brothers' harmonies to Hank Williams' heartbreak. But Elvis's ascension wasn't just about music, it was about timing. Post-war America was ready for rebellion, and teenagers finally had the economic power to demand their own culture. Elvis became their avatar, their representative in the adult world that sought to contain them. When he appeared on television, parents didn't just see a performer, they saw their authority being challenged by hip-swiveling rebellion. Set to a backbeat they couldn't understand, the machine that built around Elvis was equally revolutionary. Colonel Tom Parker, despite his questionable background and later controversial management, understood that Elvis wasn't just a singer, but a brand. The merchandising, the careful cultivation of image, the strategic media appearances, it was all part of creating not just a star, but a phenomenon. Elvis became the first modern multimedia celebrity, his image as important as his voice. The early years were a blur of touring, recording, and cultural upheaval. Every appearance brought screaming fans and moral outrage in equal measure. Religious. Leaders denounced him as a corrupting influence, while teenagers lined up for hours to catch a glimpse of their king. The contradiction was perfect. Elvis was simultaneously the most beloved and most reviled figure in American popular culture. By 1956, Elvis had achieved something unprecedented in American entertainment. He had 3 different songs at number 1 on 3 different charts, simultaneously pop, country, and R&B. This wasn't just commercial success. It was cultural domination. He had broken down the barriers that had kept American music segregated and created a new, integrated sound that spoke to young people regardless of their background. The ascension phase of Elvis's career established him not just as an entertainer, but as a force of nature that would reshape American culture forever. The seeds of Elvis's artistic decline were planted in the very success that had made him a king. By 1958, when he returned from military service in Germany, the landscape of popular music had shifted dramatically. The raw energy of early rock and roll was being domesticated, packaged into safer, more palatable forms for mainstream consumption. Elvis, once the dangerous rebel who had terrified parents across America, found himself trapped in a golden cage of Hollywood contracts and sanitized entertainment. Colonel Parker's vision for Elvis's career prioritized financial security over artistic integrity. The movie deals seemed lucrative and safe 3 pictures a year, soundtrack albums that were guaranteed to sell, and a steady stream of income that would last decades. What nobody anticipated was how these formulaic films would slowly erode the very essence that had made Elvis special. The man who had once channeled the raw spirit of American music was now lip-syncing to lightweight pop songs in front of painted backdrops. The Hollywood years revealed the fundamental tension between Elvis the artist and Elvis the commodity. The films, with rare exceptions like King Creole, were vehicles designed to showcase his charisma rather than challenge his abilities. Blue Hawaii, Viva Las Vegas, and Clambake were profitable but artistically hollow, featuring Elvis in increasingly ridiculous scenarios that bore no resemblance to the rebel who had revolutionized popular music. The soundtracks, once repositories of groundbreaking music, became collections of forgettable pop confections written by committee. During this period, Elvis became increasingly isolated from the musical movements he had helped create. While Bob Dylan was electrifying folk music, the Beatles were conquering America, and Motown was redefining soul, Elvis was singing "Do the Clam" in front of a beach movie backdrop. The irony was crushing. The man who had taught the world to rock and roll was being left behind by the very revolution he had started. The personal toll of this artistic drift was enormous. Elvis, always a perfectionist when it came to music, knew the quality of his work was declining. Friends reported his growing frustration with the material he was forced to record, his sense that he was becoming a caricature of himself. The spontaneous joy that had marked his early recordings was replaced by a professional competence that, while impressive, lacked the fire that had made him legendary. The business decisions made during this period would haunt Elvis for the rest of his career. Parker's refusal to allow international touring meant that Elvis's appeal became increasingly domestic and insular. His failure to adapt to changing musical tastes meant that younger audiences began to see him as a relic of their parents' generation. The very success of the Hollywood formula became a creative prison that was increasingly difficult to escape. Yet, even during these wilderness years, flashes of the old Elvis would occasionally emerge. Songs like "Guitar Man" and "U.S. Mail" showed that the fire still burned beneath the surface. His 1960 recording of "It's Now or Never" demonstrated that his voice had actually grown stronger and more sophisticated during the Hollywood years. But these moments of brilliance were overshadowed by the mountain of mediocre material that surrounded them. By 1968, Elvis Presley, once the most vital force in American popular music, had become a nostalgia act, remembered more for what he had been than celebrated for what he was. By the mid-1960s, Elvis Presley had achieved something that seemed impossible for the man who had once been the most dangerous figure in American entertainment. He had become irrelevant. The cultural earthquake he had triggered in the 1950s had given birth to a new generation of artists who were pushing boundaries he had once defined. The Beatles had conquered America using the template Elvis had created, while Bob Dylan was electrifying audiences with the kind of authentic, boundary-pushing music that Elvis had abandoned for Hollywood paychecks. The numbers told a stark story. Elvis hadn't had a top 10 hit in over 3 years. His last #1 single, "Good Luck Charm," felt like ancient history in a musical landscape that was evolving at breakneck speed. Meanwhile, his contemporaries from the early days of rock and roll had either evolved or faded away entirely. Chuck Berry was in legal trouble, Jerry Lee Lewis was persona non grata, and Little Richard had found religion. Elvis, once their leader, was trapped in a cycle of meaningless movies and forgettable soundtracks. The music industry that Elvis had helped create was now passing him by. The folk revival had given way to psychedelic rock. Motown was redefining soul music, and the British invasion had brought a new energy and sophistication to popular music. Meanwhile, Elvis was singing "Yoga is as Yoga Does" in a movie called Easy Come, Easy Go. The contrast couldn't have been more devastating for someone who had once been the cutting edge of popular culture. Critics, once terrified by Elvis's power to corrupt American youth, now dismissed him as a has-been. The rock press, led by influential publications like Rolling Stone, viewed him as a relic of a simpler time, a nostalgia act trading on past glories. The very sexuality that had once seemed dangerous now appeared cartoonish in an era of flower, power, and social revolution. Elvis's gyrating hips looked antiquated compared to the authentic rebellion of artists like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. The personal impact of this professional decline was profound. Elvis, always sensitive to criticism and acutely aware of his artistic reputation, struggled with depression and self-doubt. Friends from this period describe a man haunted by the sense that he had squandered his gifts, that he had traded his birthright for a mess of Hollywood pottage. The spontaneous joy that had once characterized his approach to music was replaced by a grim professionalism that satisfied no one, least of all Elvis himself. The business structure that had created Elvis's success now seemed to be engineering his downfall. Colonel Parker's conservative approach to career management, his refusal to allow Elvis to tour internationally or appear on television, meant that Elvis was increasingly isolated from the audiences that might have rediscovered him. The very safety net that had provided financial security was now suffocating his artistic growth. Perhaps most painfully, Elvis had become a punchline. Comedy shows mocked his movies, his hair, his increasingly puffy appearance. The man who had once been too dangerous for television was now seen as safe enough to ridicule. Late-night comedians made careers out of Elvis impersonations that emphasized his worst characteristics while ignoring the genius that had made him famous in the first place. By 1968, Elvis Presley faced a crisis that would have ended most careers: complete cultural irrelevance in the very field he had helped create. The '68 comeback special wasn't just a television show, it was a declaration of war against irrelevance, a desperate gambit by a fallen king to reclaim his throne. When Elvis walked onto that intimate stage in Burbank, dressed in black leather, and surrounded by his original bandmates, he was fighting for nothing less than his artistic soul. The man who had been dismissed as a has-been was about to remind the world why they had called him the King of Rock and Roll. The special's origins lay in Elvis's own growing frustration with his career trajectory. Colonel Parker had originally envisioned another safe Christmas special, but Elvis and the show's producer, Steve Binder, had bigger ambitions. They wanted to strip away the Hollywood artifice and return to the raw energy that had made Elvis a phenomenon. The intimate sit-down segments, where Elvis performed acoustic versions of his classics with Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana, were revolutionary precisely because they were so simple. Here was Elvis, unadorned and authentic, rediscovering the power of his own voice. The performance was electric in ways that transcended mere entertainment. Elvis's voice, matured by a decade of professional singing, had gained depth and richness while losing none of its power. His stage presence, refined by years of movie-making, had become more controlled, yet somehow more intense. When he performed "That's All Right," the song that had started it all, it wasn't nostalgia, it was reclamation. He was taking back his own legacy from the Hollywood machine that had nearly destroyed it. The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. Here was the Elvis they remembered, the dangerous, sexy, compelling performer who had changed their lives. But this was also a new Elvis, one who understood both his power and his artistry in ways that the young man from Tupelo never could have. The vulnerability he showed during the quiet moments, the raw power he unleashed during the rock segments, the easy humor that connected him with his audience, it all combined to create something magical. The impact of the '68 special extended far beyond that single broadcast. It reminded the music industry that Elvis Presley was not just a nostalgia act, but a vital, contemporary artist capable of growth and reinvention. The success of the special led directly to his return to live performance, something he hadn't done in over 7 years. When he took the stage at the International Hotel in Las Vegas in 1969, he wasn't just starting a new phase of his career, he was pioneering an entirely new form of entertainment. The Vegas years that followed, often dismissed by critics as bloated and excessive, represented something remarkable, a mature artist finding new ways to connect with audiences. Elvis's Vegas performances, at their best, were theatrical spectacles that anticipated the arena rock shows of the 1970s and 1980s. His jumpsuits and capes weren't just costumes, they were the uniform of a performer who understood that he wasn't just singing songs, but creating experiences. The comeback wasn't complete. Elvis's personal struggles would ultimately prove insurmountable, but artistically, he had achieved something extraordinary. He had rediscovered his voice, literally and figuratively, and proven that even fallen kings could rise again. The '68 special became a template for artistic resurrection that would influence everyone from Johnny Cash to Tina Turner. Elvis Presley's journey from revolutionary to relic to redeemer remains one of the most compelling narratives in entertainment history. His story teaches us that true artistry isn't just about initial genius, it's about the courage to reinvent yourself when the world has written you off. The King's fall and rise reminds us that greatness isn't permanent, but neither is failure, and that sometimes the most powerful performances come from those who have everything to prove and nothing to lose. Ready to explore more untold stories of music legends? Subscribe to our newsletter for exclusive insights into the artists who shaped our culture, or share this story with someone who believes in the power of second chances.